Okay. I guess you're all tired and would like to go sleep or something. Thank you all for inviting me, for having me here. I'll do my best, even though, performing after all these great scholars is a little bit of a challenge, to say the least. I've been given the topic of aspects of social responsibility in studying language use. That's what it says on the general thing that I'll be talking about on Friday, if you're still here then. So today I just want to go by the book and talk about, let's see now, what is it that I should not press here? Is this okay? Okay, so I'll talk about the way I see language, and a little bit about method and so forth. And I just tried to sort of say basically here what it is. Responsibility, because that is what I'm going to talk about on Friday. So I want to say something general about it today, and then on Friday I'll be illustrating things having to do with responsibility. This is a fairly new concept for me and for many other people, especially in linguistics. So it's going to be very basic, or very sort of trying to sort of find a way to get into it. I'm going to say something about implicit anchoring, although Jeff has already talked a lot about that, but I'll give you my version of it, or the way I see things. And then I'm going to, if you want to, or if we have the time, I'll go into frames and constructions, because ultimately I feel more of a linguist than what maybe others do. So I'm going to take on the sort of linguistic hat to a certain extent, because and I'm proud of being a linguist, and because I feel that that's how I've been trained, that's what I know something about, that's what most of us who have been doing linguistics know something about. And there was a time in my life when I also jumped over to other things, into sociology, into cultural studies, into anthropology. Oh, this is fun, this is what I want to do. And then you realize that, well, that would really mean that I start all over again. So I then realized that no, language, linguistics, that's something I know something about. There's a lot of other people who do not know a lot of things about it. So it's my responsibility to sort of talk about these things, what I know, and take that further on to what I would want to leave to the next generation or whatnot. There's a lot of things that have come up during the discussions here that I also would have liked, or would like to sort of say something about, but I won't do that, I think. But there are certain things. I mean, you talked about stylistics and stuff. Now, I was brought up being a text linguist at the time when people in the 60s and early 70s felt that, well, maybe we should look beyond the sentence and see what it is that triggers that we can use a passive sentence rather than an active sentence. And the same thing with stylistics. Nils-Erik Enquist was my teacher at the time, and he was the sort of first. Yes, Nils, yes? It's not competing with Roman Jakobson, of course not, but he was one of the first who really brought in stylistics into linguistics. So that's where I come from, and then you kind of add more and more context, and you start to talk about discourse, but it has a long history in very different ways. Maybe one more thing that I would like to say is the thing that has come up a little bit on the side here, and that has to do with intention, because I really feel very strongly that most of what we do is sort of characterized by ambivalence, that we really don't know what we want to say when we start talking. And it's really by talking to other people we find out what we really thought we wanted to say, and we sort of go like downhill sort of thing. Okay, I want to say something, and then somebody says something back to me, and I said, oh, that's exactly what I meant, even though you didn't really mean it. But that's how you save face, that's how you communicate. So for me, ambivalence is really at the heart of things, in addition to, of course, variability, negotiability, and adaptability that Jeff has talked about. But I'm glad he did, because then I can skip over that. Okay, let's see now. It's also difficult when you don't know who's going to be here. I started out with International Pragmatics Association. Jeff, of course, is the Secretary General, the machinery that keeps it going. And I've had been very fortunate to be involved in the International Pragmatics Association. And it has sort of 3 specific goals. And one of them is the dissemination of knowledge among everyone who could benefit from insights into what we know about language use. And that's kind of what we wanted to do by being here and going abroad and going to places. And I just read yesterday about, this is from Nature a couple of days ago, Science Without Borders, that science really in order to sort of embrace everything here should really look to the world's sort of poorer nations. I'm not saying that India is poor, but I mean usually it's not the as you see, you want to become part of the 200 most or best universities or the 100 best, and of course you are, but there's such a lot of potential and talent here that even Nature now is sort of talking about. This is really, there is fighting against sort of brain drain, and also maintaining trust of the communities in which they work and so forth, that we need to sort of do this as part of spreading the word about pragmatics, but also about language studies in general. So I think that's an important thing that we're trying to do here. Okay, I won't say more about that. And then the whole thing of searching for a coherent general framework for pragmatics. That's what many of you also would like to know. How is this different from discourse analysis and all these things? We don't really, or at least I don't have an answer to that, except that we give you different perspectives on how you can approach language use. And of course, we kind of believe in what we say, because this is what we devoted our lives to. And we're all emeriti, all of us. We sort of spent 40 or 45, whatever years trying to think about language and coming up with the view that we now have. I was a generative syntactician at one point in life. I was a philosopher of language at one point in time. You just go from one to the next and no, that doesn't work. So towards the end of my talk, I'll tell you what I think works. And okay, but then the third thing here that IPRA has is the stimulation of fields of application. And that, of course, has come up a lot here. But really, for me at least, the reason I do this is that I do think that language and our knowledge of, deeper knowledge and understanding of language will help make the world a better place, if not for ourselves, but at least for the generations to come. We need a solid understanding of language. I mean, if I didn't believe that, I would go away and do something else. Yeah, so this is serious. I mean, it's not, I know that this is kind of a fluffy thing that people say, but it is really something that some of us believe in, that we think this is the way to make the world a better place. That also for me means that I don't really want to keep these descriptive theoretical perspectives apart from the applications, even from the prescriptive things, that I do want to see how you can apply these things, not only react to things that we see in the news and analyze it and say, oh, bad boy, and so forth, but you also want to proactively see that this doesn't happen in the future. Okay, yeah. We do believe, I hope, that we have some kind of free will, and so if we want to believe that, and if we think that we have some kind of free will, then we also need to find a very dynamic tertium comparationis between languages. The third of comparison. As you know, you don't compare words in two languages like that. You have to compare them in relation to a third thing. And that is the third thing that we're all looking for. And it has to be dynamic in order to mirror what goes on in our interactions and brains and whatnot. Okay. So today I'll talk about theory and method, and then these are the kinds of things that I want to talk about on Friday. Well, just to give you an idea, I'll talk about responsibility for languages, linguists' responsibilities, self-reflexivity that Jeff already mentioned, and then coming back to ideology, power, and responsibility at the end. I see that there are kind of 4 sessions because there's coffee and lunch and so forth, so this is how I envision the thing. I'm going to give you 2 small tasks for Friday. You have a lot of time to do that now, but you need to be activated. So the first task is really has to do with this. I would like you to read a foreign newspaper or look at whatever BBC, The Guardian, whatever you want to, and see to what extent where you see that India, your hometown, or whatever, some other place or activity is not properly reported on. And we can come back to that later on and bring that item with you to my class on Friday, and then think of how you think the author should have presented the news. This is part of the kinds of things that I'll be talking on Friday. So just find things. I don't know, for instance, there's a lot of talk now about the accident, the terrible accident on, was it Friday or Thursday? And that is also reported on. And when I read about that in Sweden or Finland, I get the idea, okay, so there were a bunch of people who were stupid enough to get on the rails, and the train took them away. And so it's kind of like, that it was their own fault. They shouldn't do that. So it would be nice to see, is that the way it really happened? Or what really happened? Really happened. Exactly. No case. But that was just an example, and you should always, of course, read everything that you see with that in mind. I mean, is this really what happened? And of course, I'll get back to that later on, and you read some of the stuff that has to do with that. The second task is I would like you to skim through this. This has now to do with university language policy. I don't know to what extent we'll be going into that, but it is an extremely important aspect. And we've been working in the Nordic countries on trying to figure out what we should do, because of course, all of us know that English is taking over as a global language, but at the same time, we want to maintain or talk about the importance of knowing the local languages and what they can offer to our understanding of science and our understanding of life. So what we came up with after many years or thinking about this, we went around to lots of universities, of course, in the Nordic countries, Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Iceland, Greenland, and so forth, but also into many of the other European countries. And this is now, of course, as you know, when you give recommendations, they have to go through all kinds of things. But this is now 11 recommendations, best practices that we have given to the Nordic Council of Ministers. And we would like them to, of course, implement them. Some are very basic, but have a look at this if you can sort of get it now. Think about whether this is something that could in some form be implemented, enforced in your home university, and also why not, or if they're already working, that would also be interesting. So, okay. Let me just go on. This is what I would like to talk about now. I'll say something about the basic starting points for this thing that I'm going to talk about on Friday. whole notion of responsibility and how I see it, and it may be that you think of it or see it in a very different manner. Then I will do something about pragmatics as implicit anchoring, because that's what I've been doing since the early 1980s. Then I think I'll just say something very briefly about data and methods, because I don't really have a lot to add to what all the others of you have said. If there is time, I'll go into constructions, but you might not have the energy to continue to sort of listen to that, but we'll see. This is now the quote from, again, IPRA, to further develop our understanding of the notion. No, it's not from IPRA, I'm sorry. But my objective is to sort of get a deeper understanding of, this is difficult to know where to stand, of the notion of responsibility then, as it relates to the study of language and languages. And I could give a lot of examples about this, because we just had elections in Sweden, and none of the parties got a majority. So all the party figures always say, well, we will take a responsibility for getting the country onto, to save the country, basically. All the parties say that, and of course they all blame the other parties for not joining them and not sort of doing what they are doing, and so forth. We have a lot of far-right extremist parties, both in Finland and in Sweden, and there's a whole lot of things against with what is our responsibility towards the citizens. If you get a lot of votes, then it's our responsibility to take the far-right extremist view and keep migrants out. That's our responsibility, because we have to do what the voters say, and so forth. So the word responsibility comes up all the time, and it's used almost as a buzzword, in everything now, and especially for companies in marketing, for marketing purposes also. So it becomes an empty filler. This is already okay. I mean, this is from the University of Helsinki, how to do responsible research. And so there's guide to research integrity, ethics, and so forth. So that's kind of okay. I see what they're trying to do. It's a little bit funny with responsible research, but why not? But then when you find things like that, sorry for the picture, this is a gas station, a petrol station, and it says in Finnish here, we are the world's second most responsible company in the world. And I mean, you can't say anything about that, because whenever you found something that's more responsible, then, well, we only said we were the second most responsible. So here it doesn't really mean anything, but it's interesting. Finnair now has a new channel on responsibility. I mean, you have jazz, you have kids' stories, you have all things. Now you can also listen to a channel on responsibility, basically saying how responsible Finnair is and so forth. But the word comes in, and this is what I got from Jeff, this is from a Christianity broadcast. Responsibility is intangible, except to our God, and that was then used by a company to say responsibility is intangible except for our clients. So you kind of use these things in order to, well, boost your ego or whatnot. But so at this point you're almost sort of wanting to throw this out, and I've heard this for a long time now. Responsibility has this feeling of guilt attached to it. You shouldn't use it, but it doesn't matter what you use as long as you give it some kind of interpretation or well, definition, I suppose. So the big question then is that, well, Voltaire is sort of actually said that okay, I can't remember this. I know what he did say, but I can't remember what people say that he did say. you should you should let I have my opinion, and you should let everybody else have their opinion, basically. And this has been said that everybody's opinion counts, and that's everybody should have be sort of have a specific, be responsible for their opinion, and so it's not. It's a kind of very individual thing, that individual opinion and individual responsibility is more important than the notion of responsibility in a society. And the whole idea of whether there is a collective will or not has come up. You always say that, well, the people want this to happen. Especially the extremist right-wing parties say, okay, this is what the voters want, and this is their collective will, and that's why we're doing this. It's not because we want to do it, and so forth. So, and then again, this is another example that a couple of years ago, no, it was last year, the big Gothenburg book fair decided that this year's book fair will not have the extreme right-wing group's newspaper or paper called Nya Tiden, New Times. They will not give that a stand in the book exhibition because of the extremist right movement, and that a lot of people then felt that that's great, because already last year there were lots of people who felt that they won't participate if the extremist right-wing party is there. But then there were also people who said, also cultural journalists at major newspapers, who said, well, we shouldn't do that because then we are sort of excluding certain groups of people, and that makes us not look tolerant, and a book fair should be open for everyone. And now, also the Me Too, outreach about people being treated badly. Recently, now there's a sort of general feeling that yes, Me Too is wonderful, everything's good, but it also has backfired, because women now feel, at least in Scandinavia, that it has sort of backfired against them. Now people can sort of don't have to take on the sort of don't have to sort of incorporate them to the same extent, and it's a big issue now whether to what extent this was really a good thing, except that yes, it was a good thing, but now we're getting to the next point, because it can now be used for people to sort of marginalize women even more and not bring them in, because it's a threat to some kind of groups of people who want to, men of course, who want to sort of decide themselves what they want to do. So they don't take in women because they know that it will be problematic. And this is now an issue coming in again. So the reason I'm bringing this in is that I want to get into Karl Popper's The Open Society and Its Enemies, which was first published in 1945 in 2 volumes. And he says a lot of things in those volumes, among other things, that there is really no such thing as collective will. Talking about collective will is just a tool of power. Collective will is not democracy. It's only human beings or individuals who have wills, and you shouldn't use. Well, that's not the way to go. Instead, he talks about democracy, having a democratic basis. That's the characteristic of what he calls then a responsible society. And I've asked you also to have a look at his article from 1987, Toleration and Intellectual Responsibility. And I presume you've read it, and I won't go through it a lot. But for me, that was an important thing, because he said in The Open Society and Its Enemies that we should claim in the name of tolerance the right not to tolerate the intolerant. And I think that is very important, that yes, we should be tolerant to everyone, but not to the intolerant ones. Now, of course, I realize that there's a question of definition then. Who is the person who should decide who is intolerant and not? So it is a big question and a difficult question. But I think as a leading principle, I've sort of adopted this, and I thought, okay, so from that point of view, it was a good thing that the far-right extremist party members were not allowed to take part in the book fair, for instance. Democracy for Popper is the backbone of an open society, and especially in sort of late modern societies, we're not really talking about left-wing and right-wing, but rather about open societies and closed societies. And this is my sort of interpretation of Popper, really, but democracy for him has to do with being fair, doing the right thing, freedom of speech, and all these things. I'm not sure that he specifies all this, but this is how I read him. And the opposite of democracy is then the enemies of an open society, where impersonal forces steer social development, where structures shape us. And then he comes in with this, well, that through open discussions and dialogues with all parties, we get a constant self-reflection. We can achieve democracy. And this might sound fluffy and whatnot, but I really think that this is at least what I want to do, and I want to try to implement also in Pragmatics, the whole idea of being open to new ideas and so forth, that we ourselves should form and create the structures that we want to live in. And so for Popper, and also what I think is that what we need to demand of an open society and its individuals is then really responsibility. It's kind of programmatic what I'm saying here, but only democracies, Popper says, have mechanisms for how to replace and dethrone bad leaders, democracies that take responsibility. And I was thinking of the Dalai Lama's continuous thing, we need to continue talking to each other, and I still believe kind of, well, maybe if we talk to each other, things won't be as bad as they sometimes seem. Okay. These are things that you've all read, and you know them by heart now, but I wanted to put them up nevertheless. These are his 4 ethical principles. We're searching for a joint understanding. Popper would probably say it's a joint understanding or a truth, but I think true understanding is what I would like to say here instead. Common, collective, united, mutual search for scholarly-based understanding. That is what we do as scholars. That is the whole purpose of us doing here and being here and becoming a scholar, and that's the reason why we do research, to get a joint understanding, different people and peoples around the world. And then the most crucial thing maybe is that when we do that, we have to be modest, humble, unpretentious. Now this is something that today, with all the citation indices and all these things, people will just laugh at. But it is the basis on which we build the idea why we do research, why we try to find a deeper understanding of things. And it's emeriti like me who have to say this, because nobody else will tell you. They will say, you look at your citation index and whatnot. That's not the important thing. It's good to have them, and it's good for your job and so forth. But please remember that this is important, that it's really your findings that are important, not who found them. Although you would, of course, like to have your name associated with something important, because that means that you can get a job. But that's just for you. You're working for humanity here, I hope. Mutual tolerance. And that also means that being tolerant to other people's opinions and others. And it's not just relativism. It doesn't mean that anything goes, because we do this together. And I think it's also our responsibility not to be tolerant to intolerance here. So if somebody says you're stupid, you don't have to worry about that guy, because you have done your research and this is what my data and my theory says, and you stick to that and you show that it is important, also irrespective of whether you get it published in in a big journal or not. And I mean, even sort of somebody in the field that you don't like at all, they do have good ideas. It's not so that you can't go through life and say, okay, I will never read X, whatever it be, Chomsky or Verschuren or whatnot, because I don't like pragmatics, I don't like generative syntax and so forth. You have to really read everything and make up your minds yourself. So that has to be the idea of being tolerant and trying to incorporate this, what they say, into your understanding. And then his fourth ethical principle is this intellectual responsibility. Retaining a critical, dynamic way of approaching challenges. Being responsible intellectually also for what you say. Okay, he says much more than this, but I won't go into any detail about this. I have myself really been working on responsibility for the last 25 years or so, just sort of by accident kind of came into it, but, well, not by accident, but trying to sort of figure out what to do with it, because I feel that this is important, and it took me some time then to get things done, and a couple of years ago I did finally finish one thing that I edited with one of my PhD students on discourse and responsibility in professional settings, trying to it was also published in a other version in the Journal of Applied Linguistics and Professional Practice. That's the version that you have all seen, and in that I gave you an overview of how we talk about responsibility, so I presume you read that. Talking about, among other things, linguist responsibilities, and this is just you don't have to read this, but this is from the blurb of the book, to sort of that they wrote, that strengthens the case for analyzing discourse from the point of view of discourse participants' accountability and responsibility, and we try to systematically address the ways in which responsibility relations are construed in language use, and we look at media, healthcare, and social work, and talk about responsibility not being a stable quality of people and institutions, but a dynamic and variable resource that language users negotiate in interaction. And I just also put up the table of contents here, just to give you an idea that, okay, we try to here talk about responsibility generally. This is more or less the same thing as you've read, but it was published someplace else or in the journal, and then healthcare and social work, and then in the media. So these are the kinds of things that I've been working on and thinking about if you're interested, but I won't sort of say anything more about that. You can look that up in case if you're interested. In Sweden, we have this little bear called Bamse. He has the kind of honey that when he eats that, he becomes very strong, and and there's some wolves and foxes and other people who always tease him and his friends, and whenever they come and are nasty, then Bamse will come and eat a little bit of honey, and he gets to be very strong, and he can help all the little people that's the bad guys then are not nice to. And his slogan is that if you're strong, you have to be kind. And I think that's a very important, Jeff is laughing here, but I think this is very important also to remember that if you kind of have power, you have to really take responsibility much more than if you don't have power. And also if you take responsibility, you should at least be given some kind of power. I mean, you should sort of count on having power. So, well, I call this the yin and yang of life, but the point is that we position ourselves in relation to notions having to do with responsibility. A responsible citizen, that's an important person that we also would probably like to be ourselves. We position ourselves in relation to notions of our sense of responsibility towards others, in relation to discourses about responsibility, different voices in discourses about responsibility. So I'm trying to build up this thing that the notion of responsibility, even though it isn't really talked about so much in these contexts, it is really something that we kind of implicitly take on and take in, and we position ourselves into that. Is this a person that's responsible or not? And am I myself being responsible or not? So that's kind of well, having to do with power also, and I wanted to bring this into pragmatics because we have all these basic reference points that I put up here, like ideology, that Jeff will talk about more tomorrow, culture, context has come in a lot, genre, and so forth. They're good candidates for being the sort of basic reference point for being a universal tertium comparationis, the thing that you compare different aspects in different languages to. But I want to say that you also should bring in responsibility here as a reference point for pragmatics research. Getting something more dynamic into pragmatics. I say here language users are not static, as we've heard, but orient and position themselves in relation to their sociality, their co-participants, and their attitudes. So that's why I'm trying to really put in responsibility as a very important notion in any kind of pragmatics research. I put up also this that I know that you read about, but these are some of the basic distinctions with respect to responsibility that you kind of have to know about before you start talking about it in a very loose manner. So there's the, individual or personal versus collective organization's responsibility. Typically, the individual responsibility is the prototype. I am responsible, but nowadays more and more companies are responsible or use the notion responsibility for various purposes. We have to make a basic distinction between moral versus legal responsibility, sometimes more or less the same thing that other people talk about as substantial, informal, natural, contracted. The difference between being a responsible consumer, which is kind of has to do more with the moral, substantial, natural one, and then accepting responsibility for spilling oil, which is more like the legal or the contracted responsibility. These are basic important notions that you have to keep in mind whenever you get into the field of responsibility. It's also a difference between being irresponsible and choosing not to be responsible. Again, tools for talking about responsibility. Some kind of responsibility is negotiable, others non-negotiable. We have ethics as a general thing, especially in universities, how you are ethical, and then in English in particular, we have the difference between responsibility and accountability. It's always difficult. One of them, typically responsibility, has to do with guilt, and the other maybe not. And then the thing that I go getting into now, which has to do with implicit and explicit marking or anchoring, as I say, of responsibility with linguistic features. And then, of course, Jeff has talked about this quite a lot, so I probably can do this fairly rapidly. But these are some of the things that you kind of have in your toolbox already when you try to look at responsibility. It's not a fluffy thing there, but you have to sort of ask yourself things about, okay, if I want to say something about responsibility here, is it sort of an individual thing? Is it a legal or a moral thing? Is it negotiable and so forth? So these are the kind of tools that you can sort of make use of. Now, the thing then that Jeff also talks about, how then is responsibility mediated, expressed, brought about in language use? And this is where I get into what I call implicit anchoring. How you implicitly, subconsciously sort of get into what happens, or how you find out what happens between the lines of what you're saying. The thing that Jeff talks about as implicitness, that you seemingly say something, but all the time something else is happening between the lines, under the surface of what you're saying. And for me, that is pragmatics. That is, for me, what I think pragmatics should be doing. To look between the lines of what you say, under the surface, subconsciously, if you want to use that as a technical term. And then I have a couple of parameters that I always use. Here I just call them the sociocultural, interpersonal, and responsibility to oneself. This has to do with sociocultural issues generally in relation to societal or group ideologies and the values and habits that are the norm of the culture and society. Whenever you do something, you have to take that into account, the society that you are in, also with respect to responsibility, as with respect to ideology, interpersonal things, in relation to one's co-participants in conversations, discourse, and text, and in other communicative situations, and then the responsibility in relation to one's internalized values, attitudes, emotions, and so forth. So these, again, are tools for me. This is how I approach a text and look at it from the point of view, from the perspective of responsibility. So let me just say a couple of words about pragmatics as implicit anchoring. I can do it rapidly because Jeff has talked about it, but I won't go into all the nitty-gritty details that he talked about. Charles Morris is usually seen as the father of the kind of pragmatics that we do. We have Charles Sanders Peirce being the father of semiotics, Ferdinand de Saussure being the father of linguistics and so forth, but we've kind of taken over Morris as our father, or mother if you want to, where he says then that in terms of the three correlates of the triadic relation of semiosis, as he calls it, he wants to abstract a number of other dyadic relations: the syntactical dimension of semiosis, the formal relation of signs to one another, and that's what he calls syntactics, what we usually talk about as syntax nowadays. And then the relation of signs to the objects to which the signs are applicable, that's what he calls the semantical dimension of semiosis, and he'll call that semantics. And then the relation of signs to interpreters, that he calls the pragmatical dimension of semiosis, and that's what he names pragmatics. I know you probably know all of this, but this is kind of the three-way distinction that we, at least I work with constantly, the distinction between these three, and I want to keep them up. I just made up a thing here because to indicate that basically form, structure, whatever you call it, you can physically measure things. In phonetics, you have sounds that you can measure. Meaning has to do typically with cognitive, psychological, but also, of course, interactional aspects. Language in relation to thinking and so forth. And then function, where you more specifically deal with the social, cultural, and historical aspects, carrier of tradition and whatnot. And so typically that's what semantics does, and this is what pragmatics does, if you want to keep up this three-way distinction. Because I know, of course, that there are a lot of theories and method and whatnot that feel that we only need form and function, form and meaning. I don't care about that. But for me, the three-way distinction is very important. And this is, of course, a very simplification, because, of course, I know that meaning also comes about interactionally and so forth. But traditionally, this is the way it sort of kind of started. I put some of the different types of realizations here in writing, just to illustrate this. So for me, function is pragmatics. And for Morris, that means all the psychological, biological, and sociological phenomena which occur in the functioning of science. That's everything. Everything that has to do with functioning is there. That's what we call pragmatics. So, and if we then think that the general attempt in pragmatics is to go behind what's written or what is said or what is signed explicitly, reading between the lines, whereas the lines then are what we typically think of as grammar. And this is, of course, again, something that Jeff brought up, that the sort of explicitness is never explicit, but I'm thinking of it in terms of grammar here, maybe, which is also influenced by everything. And I just, for the sake of things, I just made up this thing that grammar is not something that's not influenced or doesn't have an impact on other things, because it is really the central thing of everything. And before you scream no, let me say what I mean. Because it means that you have to rethink what grammar really is. Grammar, for me, is the abstraction of any organization into significance on whatever level. It doesn't say much, I know that, but it has to be something that we can cling to, something that we have as resources for talking, for communicating, that we can refer to. And the grammar of a particular language then would be a systematic generalization, abstraction of the organization of linguistic units into meaningfulness. And this is a very sort of, well, it's kind of the kind of things that Jeff put up here with definition of language. You don't understand it unless you know the background of it. But meaningfulness, in a very broad sense, a linguistic unit can be basically anything. Grammar has to be usage-based. And if we follow the Morrisian way of thinking, usage can be then described in terms of constellations of form, meaning, and function in context. And these constellations we can then express them as generalizations over instances. And this is why I say that I'm kind of a linguist more than anything else, because I think this is the capacity and knowledge that we linguists have without going into some other field. So I do want to sort of have a look at the systematizations of the linguistic resources that we have access to. Grammar for me is applicable to all units, also to any kind of it's a system behind any kind of languaging, any kind of use of language, behind what we do when we use a language. Grammar describes the resources that we have. There are no modules, no arrows, no transformations, nothing like that. That's just a sort of silly things, but it's on all level. Because also we have the dynamic aspects worked into it. What's characteristic of all living languages is that they continuously change. And if you don't have a change, then it's a dead language. And in order to be able to adapt to new situations, they have to change. So the dynamic aspect is there all the time. So, sorry?
I wish we were taught grammar.
Oh, okay. I'll come to your school. I just put up this is from Habermas, but that's why it's so important that for language studies and for working with languages, you cannot just sort of, like in the early 20th century, you wanted linguistics to become a science and you wanted it to be a sort of an empirical analytic thing. That's why my degree in in linguistics from Reading University was in linguistic science, it said, because that's how people thought. But you have to bring in the historical hermeneutic aspects and the social sciences, all of these. And this is why language and linguistics is so important, because it covers all of this. You can't just say, okay, I'm a historian, I do this, and I don't do anything else, or so language is there all over. Now, how then can we operationalize the difference between meaning and function? But that again is something that Jeff has already talked about in his way. I see them as two different perspectives on language, not modules or levels or anything like that. I don't believe in that. Again, this is a little bit bad, but typically, traditionally, we have, if we take structure, meaning, function here, we have, okay, phonology, morphology is over here, structure and so forth. Syntax is typically done, structure and clause level. Text, well, text linguistics, maybe discourse analysis if you wanted to do that on the structure only. Meaning, you have the same, well, lexicology here, semantics on this level, and function. Typically, you have discourse analysis or pragmatics here. So you chop up. Somebody asked about what is the difference between discourse analysis and pragmatics. It's really just a tradition of how you want to do things. Okay, so I do pragmatics, you say, and that has to do, basically, had to do with clauses and the function of clauses. And then you get into presuppositions and a clause is what does this clause refer to and what does it presuppose. But really, as I said, all of this has to do with pragmatics, all of this has to do with semantics. And so I then make the distinction this way. This is the explicit anchoring, and this is the implicit anchoring that we should be dealing with. Two types of anchoring, what happens. And I've said this already several times, that meaning, for me, is the explicit in language, knowing fully well that you can never be totally explicit, but that's not the point. Meaning is, for me, what has been codified, and so I count the lexical, propositional, discourse, semantic, whatever, semantic meaning. Like, you know nothing about the implicit in language. You, second person singular, know, verb of knowing, and put in cognition here. And then function is the implicit in language, what takes place between the lines of what one says. What is implicated, aspects of the speakers that cannot be held responsible for. Things that you can say that nobody can take you to task and say, why did you say that? If I say, well, you know nothing about implicit in language surprises me anymore, and somebody says, no, I don't. I say, what? Then you're sort of propositionalizing the you know here, which it wasn't. I mean, you can joke with language, you can do all kinds of things with language, but that's how I have seen things and worked on things. Just took names here because I've been working on names lately, and they seem to be very explicit. But of course, you also know that because names are things that we all carry with us, we give names to our kids and so forth. But we also know that the choice of name is a very important act, because every name carries different associations, different connotations, different things having to do with your ancestors and so forth. And also the choice of what name one uses in a particular situation, if you use a slang name, a last name, first name, a description when you want to talk to somebody or about somebody, is also much more than just purely referential meaning. And here are just some of the things that you have to keep in mind. I mean, names have always been there, but people haven't really looked at them so much from a pragmatic point of view. We know from philosophy of language that the big debate over whether Venus is a morning star or evening star or both, and what it refers to and so forth, all the deixis in lexicality that we've heard about, cultural aspects, and of course in legal documents, names are extremely important. When you come in here and your passport is not exactly the same as you have said that it is. For me, it's always difficult to know what you should do with the the one, the O with the dots on, should you transcribe it as OE, or should you just have O? Because different cultures and different do it. And if I just write Ostman, then people say, that's not your name, it's Ostman, and is supposed to be OE in different parts of the world. Okay, so we heard about linguistic landscapes and also social media communication, and we'll hear more about that on Wednesday, I understand, categorization by names and so forth, and very importantly also space and place of how you, what was the thing that you, Rukmini, said about, you said something about a map. Was it you who said a map without the? That was Jenny. A map.
A map of the world without a space for utopia is of no use.
Yes. So okay. So there, the place for utopia. That is the place, that the imagined place that you put in there. That's why it's so. I know that, but it wouldn't. Okay, I'm just saying that it's been there all the time. You have a space like this town, but for us now who've been here, we think of it as a place, as something else, because we know about it and we have this lovely view of all the people here and so forth, and we made it into something else by just having some kind of connection to it. And this is of course very important nowadays in linguistic and pragmatic research of how you make a space into a place, how you make, by the linguistic science and so forth, how you make something into something else. And I might be talking about that a little bit more. So we've created a thing that we call socio-onomastics, looking at how names are used in different ways in the world, basically, and what connotations and how you can look at names from a very different point of view, as not just a simple thing that, well, we won't be dealing with names, which is what typically happens. Okay, here are just some of the things when Jeff said that you don't know how to, if it's expressed, then it isn't implicit anymore, but I don't see it that way. I really see that all these ways of using pragmatic particles, discourse markers, whatever you call them, or that are not propositional and not, they say something about your attitudes and your relation to what you're saying, and also to what goes on in the rest of the communicative situation. Different discourse patterns, the way you shape your discourse, the way you present it, says something about how you implicitly want to do it. I'm looking forward to Rukmini talking more about narratives, because that's what I've been using also myself, of how you position yourself differently in different narratives in order to sort of say things that you don't really say explicitly. Okay, that's supposed to be connotations of words that you know, if you say that somebody's economical or an economic and somebody's stingy, it's the same thing, but you're saying something more if you say that that person is stingy, even though it means exactly that it's a very economic person. So something more was said there that we've already heard about. But what I also want to say, that all words, phrases, clauses, prosodic patterns have both an explicit and an implicit meaning and implicit function. These are the potentialities. Well, this is of course something that Jeff has already talked about. I've come to it from a different point of view, but basically there are potential meanings and then there are actualizations of the meanings and the functions. And this is also a distinction that can be then used to applied as a tool to operationalize other kinds of distinctions. For instance, the distinction between opinions and attitudes. Basically, that an opinion is what you can ask for somebody, what do you think about this? You get that in questionnaires that you send out. People will say something, that's their opinion. But if you really want to get at their attitudes or what they really think, you have to use other ways of doing that. Personally, I would then interview people, and read between the lines of a narrative the way they express things, or using matched guise techniques and so forth to get at what people really think about, say, English coming into universities. And this is an important thing because, at least to me and to many others, it's the attitudes that govern language change, not what you think about English or Hindi or Finnish or Swedish, but the attitudes that are behind, below the sort of behind the lines of what you, between the lines of what you say. That's what govern linguistic change. That's what makes things change, really, not the views of prestige or not. You have to sort of get at the attitudes in order to understand. At least that's what we've found in all the discussions that we've had and the research that we've done. I just put up this to sort of say that this is a basic distinction that we can also use as a tool. This is see what I get here. Okay. Well, I can take this one first. This is a sort of a kind of micro perspective, propositional concept. This is what traditional linguistics has been working on, utterances, arguments, and so forth. Below that, I put up the implicit subconscious, the expressions of affect, interactional practices, and here the macro perspective has to do with the discourse patterns, the established patterns of argumentation and discourse, and the ideology here behind that as the implicit thing. And for me, then, that's what the distinction that I just brought in here between the sociocultural, the interpersonal, and then the involvement affective aspects that you have to sort of use in order to get at what's happening here. And whenever you do things like this, I mean, this might seem like, okay, so maybe this will help, but you always have to keep in mind that language takes place in society, in a bigger picture. And if you talk to, as I've done, to other people working on communication, you realize that, okay, we have all these things going on that affect the explicit patterns and the implicit ideology here with the sort of kind of political system as an example here, decisions taken there, and the output goes into the explicit laws and strategies that you want to uphold, and then you have the ideology behind it, and then you get an outcome here. This is what somebody says, that this is how university should be run, and this is what really happens because you have your own ideologies in. And then it goes in again to the political system or whatnot. As an example, that you can't, language doesn't occur in a vacuum. There's always other kinds of systems. And that's why it's important to know about the other fields of research and other disciplines. But you don't have to become another person to do that. So all of this may sound a little bit fluffy, but that's really because traditionally pragmatics has been sort of glued on top of these essentialistic elements of structure plus inherent meaning, and then you just add pragmatics and then it becomes a fluffy thing. We'll talk about that next week. And if you take this other perspective, then you get a different view. But Rukmini also talked about starting with usage, but I want to be that much of a linguist that I still think that the resources that we have at our disposal are things that we also as linguists need to look at. So, well, I don't know whether I'll get into that, but names that I talked about are very important. For instance, in contact situations, Marco Jacquemet talked about his data where he showed that somebody came over, a refugee came over, and this woman was sort of talking about, I came over here, and then a man carried me over into the thing, and then the sort of official said, Karimi, a name. Okay, so the next time they saw, now I do want to know who Karimi is. And the poor refugee had no idea what was going on. because she, of course, didn't realize that this had been interpreted as a name, the Karimi, and because that's what officials look for, names. You want to know where people come from, you want to know the explicit parts of where you come from, and then you can go on and say, is this a real refugee or not? If you don't know, have the arsenal of lots and lots of names, then it doesn't really, you won't be let into the country. Okay, so names are important, just as a indication here if you want to do something interesting and new. Okay. Sorry?
What Marco was talking about was you have to, for the interviewer of refugees, you have to give them the count to not only specific places which you should show some recognition of actually having been there, but the interview is grasping some set of relationships, and they interpret relationships among people to be, recognizable names. Give the name of your sister, give the name of your brother.
Exactly.
And then there was a misinterpretation of the language.
Yes.
I mean, she was actually speaking to a French speaker in French. I think that's the way they speak French. But it was actually French.
Yeah.
At least in online, it was an African.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which has a very different stress level. And it was that different stress level. So it is a linguistic argument. Stress is part of the misled the interpreter.
Yeah.
But it is this necessity, it is the name was gained in this interview to be able to clearly to demonstrate some knowledge of a set of relationships that have led into this position.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. You.
My sister was killed, my father was tortured,
Yeah.
this society.
Yeah. Yes.
In the colonial context,
Yes.
because that system of census taking meant that people had to report with surnames, and it meant a whole change. We are working on in terms of cultural indicator and reference. So India is a very complex. I mean, when you look at these common Indian names like, we have names like Rekha and Bindu, right? Very common. What is Rekha? Line. Dot. How you attract people about Akriti, form, line, dot, and then all the words. So I think my students to work on naming and reference.
Good.
Investigating lineages as well as attributed. So India is a very good field, and I'm going to start this research, so please. But
I'm very happy to hear this. Yes, yes.
so we have already said that because of the colonial history of naming and census records, it is a very sophisticated field in India. That's why I'm
Yes, no, that's very important because it's also, as you know, yes, and names are very important also in the United Nations. They have the sort of whatever it's called, a committee of geographical names and stuff like that, where top leaders talk about whether it should be, Beijing or Peking and whatnot. So I just wanted to say that names are something that sort of in general sort of typical linguistic research is not really talked about. It's just a weird noun phrase, but a lot of onomasticians work on that and have come to very interesting conclusions that we also need to bring into linguistics. Exactly. Yeah. 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 No, that's good. That's good. No, well, it's not. It's good that you take names seriously. That's only because they haven't been taken seriously in many of the groups of people that have talked about languages. Okay, so.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. Okay.
We're talking about this Kalapurana. Place names. This Kalapurana. The place where you are, that has lineages of naming, right? So if somebody's got, so there's not, and they've actually got a name, Kalapurans. So, because the history is connected with place names.
Yeah.
So those people names and place names in both very, very. I mean, people don't talk about this because nobody has made it a central topic in linguistics in the West. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of.
Okay. Good.
So thank you for bringing that up.
Good. Would you? I mean, if you talk about nouns and noun phrases and stuff like that, ever, do you consider names to be types of noun phrases?
Yes, sense of reference.
Well, why?
Why do you consider noun phrases to be?
Well, what I want to say is that you really have to rethink that also, because that is the typical thing that we have noun phrases, and then we have real noun phrases, and then we have names as something that's a little bit weird, and that is again something that, yes, that's not what they really do. Anyway, we'll get back to that. But okay. Good, so that's a field if somebody is interested in that. I wanted to say a little bit, just very, very briefly, because there's so much talk about this, but for me, usage-based data is what I do. I do a lot of field work. I just came back from a couple of days of field work up in the forests in northern Sweden, where we sort of talked to migrants who came pretty early on and see how they have been integrated, and talked about identity construction and so forth there. Focus group discussions is what I want to typically have people talk to each other, and then I can sort of analyze all the small stories and life stories and so forth of what goes on in order to get at what their real worldviews, attitudes and so forth are. And of course there are historical sources that you can go back to. I found it extremely interesting. I just told Jeff sometime, just a couple of days ago, or was it yesterday or this morning, that I did a study of the Finnsburg fragment in 1994, the thing that's always debatable whether this is part of Beowulf or not, and we tried to sort of make an analysis of it with the sort of modern tools of the sort of where the golden section comes and so forth, arguing that this is not a fragment at all. This is a full story and nothing else. And you could do that, or the suggestion is, because we were using new kinds of methods, new kinds of theories that have not been, that are typically not used even still. So those are important things also. Of course, media discourse, I've been doing that for quite some time. But that's the kind of data that I typically work with. Methods, any kind of linguistic analysis I just put in here, and in particular then the implicit anchoring and what we'll come to if we have time. Narrative analysis and positioning is what I've been working on. Styling, being somebody else when you talk to somebody and trying to accommodate to other people. To get credibility in a group. Place and space, I already mentioned that, of how you make a space into a place with language. Socionomastics, I mentioned that, of importance of names, and then we use a lot of methods like kind of matched guys. We went out and had 600 people sort of respond to a certain, to something, and then we got what they really view. I might talk about that just in case you're interested. And then linguistic features, anything really. These are some of the things that I have been working on, but anything that comes up, kinds of things that Jeff talked about also. and some really weird constructions. And I would like to say a little bit about constructions before I go on. I'm also very much interested in dialects, and especially in dialect writing, because that has become a really hot the way to express your identity as a dialect speaker, and also the songs performed in dialects that nobody thought would make it, and they become sort of national hits in Finland and also in Sweden. So that's something that's come up very recently now, of how you can work with dialects and constitute and create your identity with them. And I've also worked quite a lot with postcards and published a couple of books on that. But I want to say something about linguistic things, and I know this might not be things that you want to hear now, but as I said, I was trained as a linguist and even as a formal linguist, and I want to not to throw that out. And so Chuck Fillmore in the early 1980s, when I was there, also developed a thing of, he would never call it a theory, but a way of looking at language that he called construction grammar. And that's what first time I thought, okay, this works. And that's why I want to say to you, in case you're interested, where the whole notion of construction is a technical term. It's not just any construction. It's a technical term. It's an abstract thing, just like morpheme, phoneme, lexeme, where you have, the morphs that you find, you make it into a morpheme, and then you can talk about allomorphs. But you can't talk about allomorphs before it has been abstracted into a morpheme. Okay? So the same thing with the structures are what you find, the construction is the generalization of what it is, and then you can talk about the construct when you actually use something or describe it in the same way as you talk about allomorphs. This may be too technical, or maybe you know this already, but constructions are generalizations over instances, usage-based. I call this maximalism, to sort of be as far away from minimalism as possible. I build in everything into the construction rather than trying to find the sort of least common denominator. And I'll show you what I mean very briefly and very rapidly. So this is this is where we're at. This is up there. I'm sorry. With the sort of frame semantics and construction grammar, and I'm just taking the mainstream Chomskyan linguistics someplace here, and all the other things being outside. I apologize. Of course, I shouldn't show this picture when we're in India, but this is what the sort of mainstream is talked about. So. And there are quite a lot of these things that people get annoyed at. Why do you talk about generative stuff and so forth? But you have to remember also that when Chomsky 57 talked about generative, he said that it has to be able to systematize it, make it formal, to systematize. Nothing like the things that it had sort of became a generative grammar is a bad thing. No, for Chomsky in 57, it was just you have to be able to make it systematic, and it has to be not only a grammar of a sort of set of data, but it has to be able to look beyond that. So that's okay. It has to integrate all these aspects that we talk about as components. We don't want components. A construction has all of this built into it from the very start. We don't want them to go through all kinds of, boxes and whatnot and change and so forth. It has to be universal, and it has to be in accordance with what we know about cognition, social interaction and culture. Okay, I'll skip over this, but I just wanted to say this is very basic and people will get nervous when they see it, so it's a good thing that I jump over it. I wanted to say that you have to see these constructions as resources, not as any kind of abstraction in any other sense. They are the resources we have access to. And let's see and then you bring in frames, which is a kind of sister theory to construction grammar, and that has to do with the semantics of understanding, that in order to understand the word, you have to bring in all these sort of the frame that it is incorporated, or the frame that it is part of. And I'll just show you what I mean, because now we should go. So this is the responsibility frame, and I wanted to say that there's a lot of words that we find that have to do with responsibility. Here are just some of them. And in order to understand any of these, you have to sort of, once you use one of them, all the others come up and you see them in relation to that. And in order to understand a word, you have to see the scenes that it brings with it. First this happens, then that happens, and so forth. That's the way to sort of understand a word. So now, just for my final point then maybe, that constructions, as we've seen here, have internal and external features, and the external features specify the constraints and the possibilities of a construction as a resource. So and this is what I've been doing now, I call it construction discourse, when I see discourse as the same level of abstraction as grammar. So construction discourse includes context in grammar. So context is part of grammar, not something outside of grammar. That's what I wanted to say. And in order to do that, and I know of course that many people will not think of this or like this, and this is not what we should do, but we also need to think as linguists of what we can do with context, however we sort of conceptualize it. So these are the external features that determine or that sort of influence how you interpret something like responsibility. These are all the sort of sociolinguistic variables, speech community, the things that we've talked about now, and so forth. So that's kind of what I do, and I would like to say that issues of responsibility are also linguistic notions that can and need to be explicated in order for us to get a full picture of what we really think are talking about when we talk about responsibility, for instance, in relation to migration. Okay, so maybe, and I see this as the responsibility of us linguists to work out these things, because nobody else will be able to work out the sort of the grammar of a notion like responsibility. And responsibility is an important notion also as an item, as a tool to understand language. Okay, you're getting tired now, so I'll finish with this. Thank you.